On the Making of Man, by St. Gregory, Bishop of Nyssa, to his brother Peter, the servant of God. If we had to honor with rewards of money those who excel in virtue, the whole world of money, as Solomon says, would seem but small to be made equal to your virtue in the balance. Since, however, the debt of gratitude due to your reverence is greater than can be valued in money, and the holy Eastertide demands the accustomed gift of love, we offer to your greatness of mind, O man of God, a gift too small indeed to be worthy of presentation to you, yet not falling short of the extent of our power. The gift is a discourse, like a mean garment, woven not without toil from our poor wit, and the subject of the discourse, what will perhaps be generally thought audacious. For he alone has worthily considered the creation of God, who truly was created after God, and whose soul was fashioned in the image of him who created him, Basil, our common father and teacher, who by his own speculation made the sublime ordering of the universe generally intelligible, making the world as established by God and the true wisdom known to those who by means of his understanding are led to such contemplation. But we who fall short even of worthily admiring him, yet intend to add to the great writer's speculations that which is lacking in them. For it is not to be thought of that lofty mouth should suffer the insult of being given as authority for our discourses, but so that the glory of the teacher may not seem to be failing among his disciples. For if the consideration of man being lacking in his hexameron, none of those who had been his disciples contributed any earnest effort to supply the defect, the scoffer would perhaps have had a handle against his great fame, on the ground that he had not cared to produce in his hearers any habit of intelligence. But now that we venture according to our powers upon the exposition of what was lacking, if anything should be found in our work, such as to be not unworthy of his teaching, it will surely be referred to our teacher. Well, if our discourse does not reach the height of his sublime speculation, he will be free from this charge and escape the blame of seeming not to wish that his disciples should have any skill at all, though we perhaps may be answerable to our censurers as being unable to contain in the littleness of our heart the wisdom of our instructor. The scope of our proposed inquiry is not small. It is second to none of the wonders of the world, perhaps even greater than any of those known to us, because no other existing thing save the human creation has been made like to God. Thus we shall readily find that allowance will be made for what we say by kindly readers, even if our discourse is far behind the merits of our subject. For it is our business, I suppose, to leave nothing unexamined of all that concerns man, of what we believe to have taken place previously, of what we now see, and of the results which are expected afterwards to appear. For surely our effort would be convicted of failing of its promise, if, when man is proposed for contemplation, any of the questions which bear upon the subject were to be omitted. And moreover, we must fit together, according to the explanation of Scripture, and to that derived from reasoning, those statements concerning him which seem by a kind of necessary sequence to be opposed, so that our whole subject may be consistent in train of thought and in order, as the statements that seem to be contrary are brought, if the divine power so discovers a hope for what is beyond hope, and a way for what is inextricable, to one and the same end. And for clearness' sake, I think it well to set forth to you the discourse by chapters, that you may be able briefly to know the force of the several arguments of the whole work. 1. Wherein is a partial inquiry into the nature of the world, and a more minute exposition of the things which preceded the genesis of man. 2. Why man appeared last after the creation. 3. That the nature of man is more precious than all the visible creation. 4. That the construction of man throughout signifies his ruling power. 5. That man is a likeness of the divine sovereignty. 6. An examination of the kindred of mind to nature, wherein by way of digression is refuted the doctrine of the Anomians. 7. Why man is destitute of natural weapons and covering. 8. Why man's form is upright, and that hands were given him because of reason, wherein also is a speculation on the difference of souls. 9. That the form of man was framed to serve as an instrument for the use of reason. 10. That the mind works by means of the senses. 11. That the nature of mind is invisible. 12. An examination of the question where the ruling principle is to be considered to reside, wherein also is a discussion of tears and laughter, and a physiological speculation as to the interrelation of matter, nature, and mind. 13. A rationale of sleep, of yawning, and of dreams. 14. That the mind is not in a part of the body, wherein also is a distinction of the movements of the body and of the soul. 15. That the soul proper, in fact and name, is the rational soul, while the others are called so equivocally, wherein also is this statement, that the power of the mind extends throughout the whole body in fitting contact with every part. 16. A contemplation of the divine utterance which said, "Let us make man after our image and likeness," wherein is examined what is the definition of the image, and how the passible and mortal is like to the blessed and impassible, and how in the image there are male and female, seeing these are not in the prototype. 17. What we must answer to those who raise the question, if procreation is after sin, how would souls have come into being if the first of mankind had remained sinless? 18. That our irrational passions have their rise from kindred with irrational nature. 19. To those who say that the enjoyment of the good things we look for will again consist in meat and drink, because it is written that by these means man at first lived in paradise. 20. What was the life in paradise, and what was the forbidden tree? 21. That the resurrection is looked for as a consequence not so much from the declaration of Scripture as from the very necessity of things. 22. To those who say, if the resurrection is a thing excellent and good, how is it that it has not happened already, but is hoped for in some periods of time? 23. That he who confesses the beginning of the world's existence must necessarily agree also as to its end. 24. An argument against those who say that matter is co-eternal with God. 25. How one even of those who are without may be brought to believe the Scripture when teaching of the resurrection. 26. That the resurrection is not beyond probability. 27. That it is possible when the human body is dissolved into the elements of the universe, that each should have his own body restored from the common source. 28. To those who say that souls existed before bodies, or that bodies were formed before souls, wherein there is also a refutation of the fables concerning transmigrations of souls. 29. An establishment of the doctrine that the cause of existence of soul and body is one and the same. 30. A brief consideration of the construction of our bodies from a medical point of view. Chapter 1, wherein is a partial inquiry into the nature of the world and a more minute exposition of the things which preceded the genesis of man. This is the book of the generation of heaven and earth, saith the Scripture, when all that is seen was finished, and each of the things that are betook itself to its own separate place, when the body of heaven compassed all things round. And those bodies which are heavy and of downward tendency, the earth and the water, holding each other in, took the middle place of the universe, while as a sort of bond and stability for the things that were made, the divine power and skill was implanted in the growth of things, guiding all things with the reins of a double operation. For it was by rest and motion that it devised the genesis of the things that were not, and the continuance of the things that are, driving around about the heavy and changeless element contributed by the creation that does not move, as about some fixed path. The exceedingly rapid motion of the sphere like a wheel, and preserving the indissolubility of both by their mutual action, as the circling substance by its rapid motion compresses the compact body of the earth round about, while that which is firm and unyielding, by reason of its unchanging fixedness, continually augments the whirling motion of those things which revolve round it, and intensity is produced in equal measures in each of the natures which thus differ in their operation, in the stationary nature, I mean, and in the mobile revolution. For neither is the earth shifted from its own base, nor does the heaven ever relax in its vehemence or slacken its motion. These, moreover, were first framed before other things, according to the divine wisdom, to be, as it were, a beginning of the whole machine, the great Moses indicating, I suppose, where he says that the heaven and the earth were made by God in the beginning, that all things that are seen in the creation are the offspring of rest and motion, brought into being by the divine will. Now the heaven and the earth being diametrically opposed to each other in their operations, the creation which lies between the opposites and has in part a share in what is adjacent to it, itself acts as a mean between the extremes, so that there is manifestly a mutual contact of the opposites through the mean. For air in a manner imitates the perpetual motion and subtlety of the fiery substance, both in the lightness of its nature and in its suitableness for motion, yet it is not such as to be alienated from the solid substance, for it is no more in a state of continual flux and dispersion than in a permanent state of immobility, but becomes in its affinity to each a kind of borderland of the opposition between operations, at once uniting in itself and dividing things which are naturally distinct. In the same way, liquid substance also is attached by double qualities to each of the opposites. For insofar as it is heavy and of downward tendency, it is closely akin to the earthy. But insofar as it partakes of a certain fluid and mobile energy, it is not altogether alien from the nature which is in motion. And by means of this also, there is effected a kind of mixture and concurrence of the opposites, weight being transferred to motion, and motion finding no hindrance in weight, so that the things most extremely opposite in nature combine with one another, and are mutually joined by those which act as means between them. But to speak strictly, one should rather say that the very nature of the contraries themselves is not entirely without mixture of properties, each with the other, so that, as I think, all that we see in the world mutually agree, and the creation, though discovered in properties of contrary natures, is yet at union with itself. For as motion is not conceived merely as local shifting, but is also contemplated in change and alteration, and on the other hand, the immovable nature does not admit motion by way of alteration, the wisdom of God has transposed these properties and wrought unchangeableness in that which is ever moving, and change in that which is immovable. Doing this, it may be by a providential dispensation, so that property of nature which constitutes its immutability and immobility might not, when viewed in any created object, cause the creature to be accounted as God. For that which may happen to move or change would cease to admit of the conception of Godhead. Hence the earth is stable without being immutable, while the heaven, on the contrary, as it has no mutability, so has not stability either, that the divine power, by interweaving change in the stable nature, and motion with that which is not subject to change, might, by the interchange of attributes, at once join them both closely to each other, and make them alien from the conception of deity. For, as has been said, neither of these, neither that which is unstable, nor that which is mutable, can be considered to belong to the more divine nature. Now all things were already arrived at their own end. The heaven and the earth, as Moses says, were finished, and all things that lie between them, and the particular things were adorned with their appropriate beauty, the heaven with the rays of the stars, the sea and air with the living creatures that swim and fly, and the earth with all varieties of plants and animals, to all which, empowered by the divine will, it gave birth together. The earth was full too of her produce, bringing forth fruits at the same time with flowers. The meadows were full of all that grows therein, and all the mountain ridges and summits and every hillside and slope and hollow were crowned with young grass, and with the varied produce of the trees just risen from the ground, yet shot up at once into their perfect beauty. And all the beasts that had come into life at God's command were rejoicing, we may suppose, and skipping about, running to and fro in the thickets in herds according to their kind, while every sheltered and shady spot was ringing with the chants of the songbirds. And at sea, we may suppose, the sight to be seen was of the like kind, as it had just settled to quiet and calm in the gathering together of its depths, where havens and harbors spontaneously hollowed out on the coasts made the sea reconciled with the land, and the gentle motion of the waves vied in beauty with the meadows, rippling delicately with light and harmless breezes that skimmed the surface, and all the wealth of creation by land and sea was ready, and none was there to share it. Chapter 2. Why man appeared last after the creation. For not as yet had that great and precious thing, man, come into the world of being. It was not to be looked for that the ruler should appear before the subjects of his rule. But when his dominion was prepared, the next step was that the king should be manifested. When then the Maker of all had prepared beforehand, as it were, a royal lodging for the future king, and this was the land and islands and sea, and the heaven arching like a roof over them, and when all kinds of wealth had been stored in this palace, and by wealth I mean the whole creation, and all that is in plants and trees, and all that has sense and breath and life, and, if we are to account materials also as wealth, all that for their beauty are reckoned precious in the eyes of men, as gold and silver, and the substances of your jewels which men delight in, having concealed, I say, abundance of all these also in the bosom of the earth, as in a royal treasure house. He thus manifests man in the world, to be the beholder of some of the wonders therein, and the lord of others, that by his enjoyment he might have knowledge of the giver, and by the beauty and majesty of the things he saw might trace out that power of the Maker which is beyond speech and language. For this reason man was brought into the world last after the creation, not being rejected to the last as worthless, but as one whom it behooved to be king over his subjects at his very birth. And as a good host does not bring his guest to his house before the preparation of his feast, but when he has made all due preparation, and decked with their proper adornments his house, his couches, his table, brings his guest home when things suitable for his refreshment are in readiness. In the same manner the rich and munificent entertainer of our nature, when he had decked the habitation with beauties of every kind, and prepared this great and varied banquet, then introduced man, assigning to him as his task not the acquiring of what was not there, but the enjoyment of the things which were there. And for this reason he gives him as foundations the instincts of a twofold organization, blending the divine with the earthly, that by means of both he may be naturally and properly disposed to each enjoyment, enjoying God by means of his more divine nature, and the good things of the earth by the sense that is akin to them. Chapter 3. That the nature of man is more precious than all the visible creation. But it is right that we should not leave this point without consideration. that while the world, great as it is, and its parts, are laid as an elemental foundation for the formation of the universe, the creation is, so to say, made offhand by the divine power, existing at once on his command, while counsel precedes the making of man, and that which is to be is foreshown in the Maker in verbal description, and of what kind it is fitting that it should be, and to what archetype it is fitting that it should bear a likeness, and for what it shall be made, and what its operation shall be when it is made, and of what it shall be the ruler. All these things the saying examines beforehand, so that he has a rank assigned him before his genesis, and possesses rule over the things that are before his coming into being. For it says, God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the beasts of the earth, and the fowls of the heaven, and the cattle in all the earth. Oh, marvelous! A sun is made, and no counsel proceeds, a heaven likewise, and to these no single thing in creation is equal. So great a wonder is formed by a word alone, and the saying indicates neither when nor how, nor any such detail. So too in all particular cases, the ether, the stars, the intermediate air, the sea, the earth, the animals, the plants, all are brought into being with a word. Well, only to the making of man does the Maker of all draw near with circumspection, so as to prepare beforehand for him material for his formation, and to liken his form to an archetypal beauty, and setting before him a mark for which he is to come into being, to make for him a nature appropriate and allied to the operations, and suitable for the object in hand. Chapter 4. That the construction of man throughout signifies his ruling power. For as in our own life artificers fashion a tool in the way suitable for its use, so the best artificer made our nature as it were a formation fit for the exercise of royalty, preparing it at once by superior advantages of soul, and by the very form of the body, to be such as to be adapted for royalty. For the soul immediately shows its royalty and exalted character, far removed as it is from the lowliness of private station, in that it owns no lord and is self-governed, swayed autocratically by its own will. For to whom else does this belong than to a king? And further, besides these facts, the fact that it is the image of that nature which rules over all means nothing else than this, that our nature was created to be royal from the first. For as in men's ordinary use, those who make images of princes both mold the figure of their form, and represent along with this the royal rank by the vesture of purple, and even the likeness is commonly spoken of as a king, so the human nature also, as it was made to rule the rest, was by its likeness to the King of all, made as it were a living image, partaking with the archetype both in rank and in name, not vested in purple, nor giving indication of its rank by scepter and diadem, for the archetype itself is not arrayed with these, but instead of the purple robe, clothed in virtue, which is in truth the most royal of all raiment, and in place of the scepter, leaning on the bliss of immortality, and instead of the royal diadem, decked with the crown of righteousness, so that it is shown to be perfectly like to the beauty of its archetype in all that belongs to the dignity of royalty. Chapter 5. That man is a likeness of the divine sovereignty. It is true indeed that the divine beauty is not adorned with any shape or endowment of form, by any beauty of color, but is contemplated as excellence in unspeakable bliss. As when painters transfer human forms to their pictures by the means of certain colors, laying on their copy the proper and corresponding tints, so that the beauty of the original may be accurately transferred to the likeness, so I would have you understand that our Maker also, painting the portrait to resemble his own beauty, by the addition of virtues, as it were with colors, shows in us his own sovereignty, and manifold and varied are the tints, so to say, by which his true form is portrayed, not red or white, or the blending of these, whatever it may be called, nor a touch of black that paints the eyebrow and the eye, and shades by some combination the depressions in the figure, and all such arts which the hands of painters contrive, but instead of these, purity, freedom from passions, blessedness, alienation from all evil, and all those attributes of the like kind which help to form in men the likeness of God. With such hues as these did the Maker of his own image mark our nature. And if you were to examine the other points also by which the divine beauty is expressed, you will find that to them too the likeness in the image which we present is perfectly preserved. The Godhead is mind and word, for in the beginning was the Word, and the followers of Paul have the mind of Christ, which speaks in them. Humanity too is not far removed from these. You see in yourself word and understanding, an imitation of the very mind and word. Again, God is love, and the fount of love. For this the great John declares, that love is of God, and God is love. The fashioner of our nature has made this to be our feature too. For hereby he says, shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye love one another. Thus, if this be absent, the whole stamp of the likeness is transformed. The deity beholds and hears all things, and searches all things out. You too have the power of apprehension of things by means of sight and hearing, and the understanding that inquires into things and searches them out. Chapter 6. An examination of the kindred of mind to nature, wherein by way of digression is refuted the doctrine of the Anomians. And let no one suppose me to say that the deity is in touch with existing things in a manner resembling human operation, by means of different faculties. For it is impossible to conceive in the simplicity of the Godhead the varied and diverse nature of the apprehensive operation. Not even in our own case are the faculties which apprehend things numerous, although we are in touch with those things which affect our life in many ways by means of our senses. For there is one faculty, the implanted mind itself, which passes through each of the organs of sense and grasps the things beyond. This it is that by means of the eyes beholds what is seen. This it is that by means of hearing understands what is said, that is content with what is to our taste, and turns from what is unpleasant, that uses the hand for whatever it wills, taking hold or rejecting by its means, using the help of the organ for this purpose precisely as it thinks expedient. If in men, even though the organs formed by nature for purposes of perception may be different, that which operates and moves by means of all, and uses each appropriately for the object before it, is one and the same, not changing its nature by the differences of operations. How could anyone suspect multiplicity of essence in God on the ground of his varied powers? For he that made the eye, as the prophet says, and that planted the ear, stamped on human nature these operations to be, as it were, significant characters, with reference to their models in himself. For he says, let us make man in our image. But what, I would ask, becomes of the heresy of the Anomians? What will they say to this utterance? How will they defend the vanity of their dogma in view of the words cited? Will they say that it is possible that one image should be made like to different forms? If the Son is in nature unlike the Father, how comes it that the likeness he forms of the different natures is one? For he who said, let us make after our image, and by the plural signification revealed the Holy Trinity, would not, if the archetypes were unlike one another, have mentioned the image in the singular. For it would be impossible that there should be one likeness displayed of things which do not agree with one another. If the natures were different, he would assuredly have begun their images also differently, making the appropriate image for each. But since the image is one, while the archetype is not one, who is so far beyond the range of understanding as not to know that the things which are like the same thing surely resemble one another? Therefore he says, the Word, it may be, cutting short this wickedness, at the very formation of human life, let us make man in our image, after our likeness.